The alarm in my chest came before the alarm in the room. I felt it first, a tightening under my ribs, the kind of feeling my mother used to call the warning that walks ahead of danger. I did not know yet why my body had decided something was wrong. The hall was quiet, the lights were steady, nothing had happened. And yet every instinct I carried told me to watch the door. That is where he walked in. My name is Varel, and I am Savani, though that word means little to you, unless you already know what it costs a Savani child to sit still for 6 hours without moving a single limb. We are taught patience before we are taught language. My mother placed stones on my palms when I was small, and told me that a Savani who drops a stone before the sun sets has failed a lesson older than our cities. I carried that lesson into the academy. I carried it into the room where the new cadets gathered on the first day of the term, the room where the instructor waited with the box. I should explain the box, though explaining it will not prepare you for what happened. The Grentha Academy trains officers and diplomats from 11 worlds. It sits on a station built from the bones of an older station, itself built from the bones of something older still. Every species that studies there brings its own gift and its own wound, and the Academy has learned, over centuries, how to test both. The test for patience is the box. It is small. It fits in 2 palms. It is made of a metal that does not shine, a deliberate dullness, as if the box wants to be forgotten. There are no visible seams. There is no lock that any scanner has ever found. Cadets receive it on the first day, and cadets keep it through the whole first term, and somewhere between the first day and the final exam, most cadets never open it at all. Those who do open it are remembered. Their names are carved into a wall in the lower archive, a wall I visited once with my class, tracing the letters with my hand, feeling both awe and a small ache of longing. I wanted my name on that wall. I wanted it more than I wanted almost anything else in my life at the time. The instructor who carried the box that day was called Elder Kion Thresh, and if you have never stood in a room with him, you will not understand why even the loudest cadets fell silent when his boots touched the floor. He was Doran, a species built for endurance, tall and slow-moving, with skin like cooled stone, and eyes that seemed to measure you before you had finished a single sentence. He had taught at the academy for longer than most of us had been alive. He had given out the box for so many terms that the newer instructors called it, quietly, Thresh's box, though he never claimed it as his own. We sat in rows, 22 cadets, 11 species, all of us new, all of us nervous in our own particular ways. I sat beside a cadet named Mira Thal, a Corvain girl with quick eyes and quicker words, who leaned toward me and whispered that she had heard the box could not be opened by force, that cadets who tried had felt a jolt run up their arms, sharp enough to make them drop it, sharp enough to teach a lesson without saying a single word. I did not know if that part was true. I only knew that everyone treated the box the way you treat a small flame near dry grass, carefully, respectfully, with the assumption that it could become dangerous if you stopped paying attention to it. The instructor did not smile as he walked between the rows. He never smiled. He carried a satchel of dark cloth, and inside it, 22 boxes, one for each of us, all identical, all silent. Then the door opened again, later than it should have, and the room turned as one to look. A single cadet stood in the doorway. He was human. I had heard of humans before that day, the way you hear of a distant storm before it reaches your coast, a rumor with weather attached to it, nothing more. Humans were new to the wider galaxy, new to academies like ours, new enough that most species still argued about how to treat them. Some called them promising, some called them unstable. I had formed no opinion, because I had never stood near one. He was not large, not in the way Doran students are large, not in the way some of our other cadets from heavier worlds are large. He looked, if anything, unremarkable. Brown hair, cut short, a jacket the color of old rust, a steady, unhurried walk that did not match the tension in the room, as if he had not noticed that everyone else was holding their breath. His name, I would learn within the hour, was Daniel Voss. He crossed the room without apology, without the careful, lowered posture the rest of us used when we were late, and he took the empty seat near the front, the one no one else had wanted, because it sat directly across from the instructor's desk. Elder Thresh watched him the entire way, unreadable, the way stone watches weather. When the instructor reached him, he held out a box, the same as all the others. Dull metal, no seams. Ancient, in the way that all the boxes were ancient, though none of them were the same age. The instructor did this in silence for every cadet. He did not explain the tradition. He let the tradition explain itself over the following weeks, through struggle and patience and, occasionally, brilliance. Daniel Voss took the box in both hands. He did not sit down. I want you to understand what should have happened next, because the shock of what did happen only makes sense against that background. What should have happened is this. He sits. He places the box on the small shelf built into his desk. He studies it with his eyes only, and he waits. Because that is what everyone does. That is what everyone has always done, for longer than any living instructor could remember. Instead, standing there, still holding his bag over one shoulder, still facing the instructor, Daniel Voss turned the box once in his hands. I saw the motion clearly, because I was close enough, 3 seats away, my whole body angled toward him, without meaning to be. He turned it, the way you might turn a cup to check for a chip in the rim. Then his thumb pressed one edge, quick, almost careless, and his other hand pressed a second point near the base, and the box made a sound. A soft click. I have heard that click described since then by cadets who were not even in the room, as if the sound itself had traveled beyond the walls and reached every corner of the station. It was not loud. It should not have carried the weight it carried. But in that silence, in that room built entirely around waiting, the click landed like a struck bell. The box opened in his hands. For a long moment, nobody moved. I did not move. Mira Thal, beside me, had gone rigid, her quick eyes wide, her mouth slightly open around a word she never finished. Across the room, a Doran cadet named Bren Solvig, easily the largest and strongest of us, sat frozen, with one hand half raised, as if he had been about to applaud, and then thought better of it before his palms ever met. Elder Kaon Thresh did not move either, and that, more than anything, told me how wrong this moment was. I had watched him for less than an hour, and already understood that his stillness was not surprise. Doran do not startle the way smaller species startle. His stillness was something else. It looked, if I am honest about what I saw, like the stillness of someone who has just heard news he has feared for a very long time. Daniel Voss looked down at the open box in his hands with an expression I can only describe as mild curiosity, the kind of look you might give a puzzle in a magazine, solved a little faster than you expected, pleasant but not remarkable. He glanced up at the instructor, as if checking whether he had done something wrong, and when the instructor said nothing, Daniel simply sat down, set the open box gently on his desk shelf, and folded his hands, waiting for the lesson to continue like nothing unusual had occurred at all. It had occurred, though. Every one of us in that room understood, even if we could not yet say why, that something enormous had just happened, wrapped inside something small. The instructor did not continue the lesson immediately. He stood over Daniel's desk a moment longer than courtesy required, looking down at the open box the way you might look at a wound you were not expecting to see. Then, slowly, he reached out one long gray hand and closed it again, the two halves meeting with a soft, final sound, and he said nothing about it at all. He simply moved to the next cadet, and the next, distributing the remaining boxes as if his hands had not just trembled, faintly, almost too faintly to notice. I noticed. I have spent a great deal of my life noticing small things. It is a Savani habit, bred into us by generations who survived on quiet plains by reading the smallest signs of danger long before danger arrived. I noticed the tremble in the instructor's hand. I noticed that he did not ask Daniel how he had done it. I noticed that for the rest of that first class, Elder Thresh's eyes returned again and again to the closed box sitting quietly on a cadet's desk, as if he expected it to open itself a second time, entirely on its own. When the class ended, the room did not empty the way rooms usually empty, in a loose scattering of bodies and conversation. Instead, cadets lingered near the door in small clusters, glancing back at Daniel Voss, who was gathering his things with no particular urgency, entirely unaware, it seemed, that he had become the center of every conversation happening in whispers around him. Mira Thal caught my arm before I could leave. Her fingers were tight, and her voice, usually so quick and light, came out low and careful. "Did you see that?" she asked me, though she had clearly seen it herself, and only wanted someone to confirm that it was real. that she had not imagined it. I told her I had seen it. I told her I did not understand it. That was the truth, and it remained the truth for a long time afterward, through everything that came next. We did not approach him that day. None of us did. There is a kind of caution that settles over a group when something unexpected happens in front of all of them at once, a silent agreement to wait, to watch, to gather more information before anyone says anything that cannot be taken back. I walked back to my quarters with Mira, both of us quiet, both of us thinking about the same small metal box that had, for every other cadet in that room, remained a locked and patient mystery, and for one cadet, had opened before he had even chosen where to sit. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my bunk staring at the low ceiling of my quarters, and I found myself thinking not about Daniel Voss directly, but about the wall in the lower archive, the wall of names carved beside opened boxes, names earned across weeks or months, or, in a few legendary cases, an entire year of quiet, patient study. I thought about what it meant that a name could now be added in a single afternoon, before a chair had even been sat in. I did not know, that first night, how much that single afternoon would come to matter. I did not know that the box had never truly been a puzzle about metal and hinges at all, but a puzzle about limits, about how far a mind could be pushed before it either broke or bent gracefully around the problem in front of it. I did not know that Elder Kion Thresh, in all his long years teaching at that academy, had built his entire understanding of new species around watching how long they took to open that box, and what that told him about how they would behave when the stakes were far higher than a locked metal shell. I only knew, lying there in the dark, that something had shifted in the room that day, something none of us had the language yet to name. I knew that the instructor's hand had trembled. I knew that a human named Daniel Voss had opened, in a single motion, something that generations of cadets before him had spent their entire first term failing to understand. And somewhere beneath that knowledge, quiet and small and growing, was a feeling I did not want to admit to myself. Not admiration, not yet. Something closer to fear, the kind that arrives long before you understand what you are afraid of, the kind that walks ahead of danger, the way mine had walked ahead of me that very morning, before I even knew a human was about to walk through the door. I closed my eyes eventually, though sleep came slowly, and left early, and when I woke the next morning, the first thought in my mind was not about my classes, or my exams, or the long patient training that had shaped every day of my life until then. It was about the box, sitting closed and quiet on a desk down the hall, and the boy who had opened it as if it were nothing at all. The academy did not officially acknowledge what had happened, but academies rarely need official channels to spread a story. By the second day, every cadet in our year knew about the box. By the third day, cadets from the years above us knew as well, drifting past our study hall, with the kind of casual curiosity that fools no one, glancing toward Daniel Voss, the way you might glance at a strange light in the sky, unsure whether to be amazed or worried. Daniel himself did not seem to notice, or if he noticed, he did not seem to care. That, in itself, unsettled me more than the box had. I want to explain something about how I understood people before that term, because it matters for what came after. Among Sivani, and among most of the species I had studied beside up to that point, a sudden and public display of skill was always followed by a response. Pride, usually. Sometimes a careful, practiced humility, worn like a mask over pride. Sometimes fear of what such attention might cost you later, because among my people, being noticed too early in life can invite a kind of scrutiny that follows you for years. Whatever the response, there was always a response. You could read it. You could measure a person by how they carried an audience's attention. Daniel Voss carried nothing. He walked to his classes the same way he had walked into that first room, unhurried, his attention fixed on whatever was directly in front of him, rather than on the small crowd of cadets who now watched him from doorways and corners. When another cadet finally worked up the courage to ask him, directly, how he had opened the box so quickly, Daniel answered with something so plain that it took me a full day to understand why it disturbed me so deeply. He said it reminded him of a toy. Not a puzzle designed by scholars, not a sacred trial passed down through generations of careful teaching, but a toy, the kind children on his homeworld solve at parties, sold in shops for the amusement of the very young. He said the mechanism was clever, he would give it that, cleverer than most versions he had seen, but the underlying idea, the logic of hidden pressure points and sequence, was something he had learned to recognize before he had learned to read properly. The cadet who asked him, a Thessaly student named Owen Farr, repeated this answer to nearly everyone he met that week, and each time he repeated it, the story grew a little stranger in the retelling, until it had become less a piece of information and more a kind of warning, passed quietly from cadet to cadet, the way old sailors once passed warnings about certain waters. I heard it from Mira first, then from Owen himself, then from 3 other cadets who had heard it from someone else entirely. Each time, the core of it stayed the same, and each time, it settled a little deeper into my chest, cold and strange. A toy. A children's toy. I thought of the wall in the lower archive, the carved names of cadets who had spent months, sometimes an entire term, coaxing the box open through patient trial. I thought of my own attempts that first week, sitting with the small metal shape in my lap during every free hour, running my fingers over its seamless surface, feeling for any give, any weakness, and finding none. I was diligent. I was careful. I followed every principle my mother had taught me about patience, about reading the smallest signs before committing to an action, and I made no progress at all. Not that week, not the week after. Daniel Voss had made all the progress there was to make, standing in a doorway, before he had even chosen a seat. I do not think I can fully explain, to someone who has not lived it, what it does to a mind trained in patience to watch someone dismiss the very foundation of that training as a children's amusement. It was not that I believed him to be cruel or arrogant in saying it. If anything, his tone had been almost apologetic, the way you might apologize for finishing a meal too quickly at someone else's careful, slow-cooked feast. But the effect on the room, on the whole floor of cadets, was the same regardless of his intention. It felt as though someone had opened a curtain we had not known was covering a window, and behind that curtain was a view none of us had wanted to see. Elder Kion Thresh called Daniel to his private study, 3 days after the incident. I know this because Mira Thal, whose curiosity has never respected the boundaries most cadets observe, made a habit of walking past the instructor's corridor at the hour Daniel usually finished his morning classes. She saw him enter. She waited, she told me later, nearly 40 minutes, pretending to study a datapad near the corridor's far end, until Daniel emerged again, looking exactly as unbothered as he had looked going in. She could not hear what was said inside that room. None of us could. But she noticed, and told me with a kind of hushed excitement she usually reserved for far less serious matters, that Elder Thresh had not called for any other cadet before or since, not for private conversation, not in all the years the older students could remember. I began to understand, slowly, that the box had never simply been a test of patience for its own sake. It had been a filter, a way for an old and careful instructor to measure something about each new species that arrived at his academy, some quality he needed to know before he decided how much trust, and how much caution, to extend toward them. And Daniel Voss, without meaning to, without even understanding the significance of what he had done, had broken that filter entirely, in under a minute, in front of every witness who mattered. The following week brought its own strange developments, each one small on its own, each one adding weight to a growing unease that had settled over our year like a fog rolling in from low ground. A cadet named Priya Halden, from a species I will not name here out of respect for her privacy in this account, approached Daniel during a shared meal period and asked, half joking, whether he might look at her own box, still stubbornly sealed after nearly 2 weeks of careful effort. She told me afterward that she had expected him to decline, or to make some polite excuse, the kind any considerate person offers when asked to do something that might embarrass a friend. Instead, he took the box from her hands, turned it over twice, studied the surface for perhaps 10 seconds in total silence, and handed it back to her unopened. He told her, gently, that he thought she was close. He told her which section of the surface, in his opinion, held the give she was looking for, but he did not press it himself, did not so much as apply pressure to demonstrate. He simply returned it and encouraged her to keep trying, telling her that she would likely have it open within a few more days if she kept working the same section she had already been working. Priya opened her box 4 days later, in front of a small crowd of cadets who had gathered specifically to watch, drawn by rumor and curiosity in equal measure. She wept when it opened. I remember this clearly, because it was such a striking contrast to what had happened in that first classroom, where the box had opened in complete silence, without ceremony, almost as an afterthought. Priya's box opening was witnessed, celebrated, marked by real emotion, the kind of moment the tradition had always been built to produce. And yet even that moment, joyful as it was, carried a strange undertone, because everyone in that crowd knew that the human standing quietly at the back, having offered his small piece of guidance, and then stepped away from the attention entirely, could likely have opened that same box himself, in less time than it had taken Priya to wipe the tears from her face. I began, during that second week, to watch Daniel Voss more closely than I watched almost anyone else in my classes. I did not do this out of suspicion, not exactly, though suspicion was part of it. I did it because I could not make sense of him using the frameworks I had grown up with, and a mind that cannot make sense of something tends to keep returning to it, turning it over the way you might turn over a stone with an unfamiliar shape, looking for an angle that finally makes it fit what you already know. He was not unkind. That much became clear quickly. He answered questions when cadets asked them, patiently, without condescension, though I noticed he rarely offered information unprompted. He studied hard, harder than his easy manner suggested, staying late in the shared halls long after most other cadets had returned to their quarters, working through material that had nothing to do with boxes or puzzles at all, the actual coursework of the academy, tactics and history, and the long complicated laws that governed relations between our many worlds. He was not arrogant either, not in any way I could point to directly. When cadets praised him for the box, he tended to change the subject quickly, sometimes visibly uncomfortable with the attention, as if he did not understand why a solved puzzle mattered so much to the people around him. And that, I came to realize, was the heart of the unease spreading through our year. It was not that Daniel Voss had done something remarkable. It was that he did not seem to understand it was remarkable at all. He carried no weight from it, no pride, no particular awareness that he had shattered a tradition older than most of the species present. To him, it appeared, the box had simply been a small problem, solved the way you might solve any small problem you happen to encounter on an ordinary morning. I found this harder to sit with than open arrogance would have been. Arrogance, at least, is something my training had prepared me to recognize and respond to. This quiet, genuine lack of significance, this apparent inability to see why anyone would be shaken by what he had done, felt like standing at the edge of water and being told, by someone who had crossed it easily, that the water was not actually very deep at all, even as you yourself could not see the bottom. Near the end of that second week, Elder Kion Thresh gathered our entire year for an additional session, one not listed on any schedule we had been given at the start of term. He stood before us with the same stillness he always carried, but something in his posture that day felt different, heavier, as though he were preparing to say something he had turned over in his mind many times before deciding it needed to be said at all. He did not mention Daniel Voss by name. He did not mention the box directly, not at first. He spoke instead, at length, about the purpose of patience, about why the academy had built so much of its early training around waiting, around sitting with difficulty, instead of rushing past it. He told us that patience was not merely a virtue for its own sake, but a kind of armor, one that protected a mind from making decisions too quickly, before it had gathered enough understanding to make them safely. Then, only at the very end, his eyes moved briefly toward Daniel, seated near the front, as he always sat, attentive but unremarkable in his posture. He said, and I remember these words exactly, because I wrote them down that same evening in my private journal, that not every mind requires the same armor to survive contact with danger, and that this fact alone should trouble us far more than it should comfort us. He did not explain further. He dismissed the session shortly after, and the room emptied in a confusion of murmured questions that no one present could fully answer. I walked back to my quarters that night, turning his words over and over, the way I turn over any problem I do not yet understand. I thought about the wall of names in the lower archive. I thought about Priya's tears, and the 10 seconds it had taken Daniel to identify what she had spent 2 weeks searching for. I thought about the trembling in Elder Thresh's hand, on that very first day, before any of us understood what we were watching. And I thought, for the first time with real clarity, about a question that would follow me for the rest of that term, and for a long time after it. If the box was truly a test of what a species needed in order to survive contact with danger, and if Daniel Voss had passed that test without any of the armor the rest of us had spent our whole lives building, then what, exactly, did that suggest about the shape of the danger his people had been built to survive? I did not have an answer that night. I am not certain the instructor had one either. Not fully, not yet. But I understood, lying awake in the dark for the second time in as many weeks, that whatever answer eventually came, it would not be a comfortable one. I need to go back, briefly, to the moment itself, because I have realized in telling this account that I skipped past a detail that later became important to everyone who studied what happened that first day, and I do not want to make that same omission twice. When Daniel Voss opened the box, he did not simply solve a puzzle. He solved it in front of an audience that had no framework for understanding what a fast solution meant. And that lack of framework is what turned a private moment of skill into a public event that reshaped an entire academic year. Consider what the box represented to each of us before that day. For a Savani like myself, it represented the discipline my mother had spent my childhood building into my bones, stone by stone, quiet afternoon by quiet afternoon. For a Corvain like Mira, it represented the same discipline filtered through a different cultural lens, one that valued cleverness and observation over raw endurance, but which still assumed that real cleverness revealed itself slowly, through careful accumulated study. For Bren Solvig and the other Doran cadets, it represented something closer to a physical trial, patience measured almost like a muscle, built through repetition and strain. None of us, not one single cadet from 11 different worlds, had ever imagined that the box might simply not be difficult at all, for some mind somewhere in the galaxy. We had built our entire understanding of the box around the assumption that difficulty was a fixed property of the object itself, a hard truth built into its metal, the same for anyone who touched it. Daniel Voss proved, in a single motion, that difficulty had never lived in the box. It had lived in us. This realization did not arrive all at once, not for the rest of the cadets, and I confess it did not arrive fully formed for me either, not in that first week. It arrived slowly, in pieces, the way understanding often does, built from small conversations and smaller observations, until one day you look back and realize the shape of the thing has been sitting in front of you the entire time. The piece that finally completed the picture for me came from an unexpected source, a retired instructor named Selah Vantry, who taught a small elective on comparative cultural history to a handful of senior cadets. I attended her course that term partly out of genuine interest, and partly, I admit, because I hoped it might offer some insight into the growing unease surrounding Daniel Voss, an unease that by then had spread well beyond our own year and into conversations among instructors themselves. Selah Vantry was Thessaly, small and quick in her movements, with a voice that carried the particular calm of someone who has spent decades studying difficult things, without allowing that difficulty to unsettle her. During one of her sessions, without any prompting from me or from anyone else in the room, she brought up the box herself, speaking about it not as gossip, the way most cadets discussed it, but as a genuine subject of academic interest. She explained that the box, in its current form, had been used at the Academy for well over 3 centuries, a period spanning many different waves of cadets from many different worlds. In that entire history, she said, the box had been opened before the end of the first term perhaps a dozen times, across 300 years, by cadets whose names now filled a modest wall in the lower archive. Most cadets, the overwhelming majority, either opened it slowly over the full length of their training, or never opened it at all, graduating with it still sealed, a fact the Academy did not treat as failure, so much as an honest, unremarkable outcome. She said the box had been designed, generations ago, by an engineer whose own species valued extremely long lifespans and extremely slow cognitive development in early life, a species that measured maturity, not in years but in decades, and whose entire culture had shaped itself around the expectation that true understanding could only be earned through extended, patient effort. The box, she explained, was built as a kind of monument to that value, a physical embodiment of the idea that worthwhile things do not open quickly. Then she said something that I wrote down immediately, word for word, because I sensed even as she said it that I was hearing something important. She said that the box had never been calibrated for a mind that did not share that assumption. It had never needed to be, because in 3 centuries, no species had arrived at the Academy without some version of that same cultural patience built into their upbringing, however differently expressed. Every species before humans, she said, had been shaped by worlds that rewarded caution, that punished haste, that built long, careful traditions around the slow accumulation of understanding, because the price of moving too quickly, on their homeworlds, in their histories, had simply been too high to survive. She did not finish the thought out loud. She let it hang in the room, the way a skilled teacher sometimes does when she wants her students to complete an idea themselves, rather than have it handed to them. I completed it that same evening, walking back through the quiet corridors toward my quarters, turning her words over the way I turn over any unfinished thought. If every other species at that academy had been shaped by worlds that punished haste, and if humans had not been shaped that same way, then the box had not measured a difference in intelligence at all, and it had certainly not measured a difference in worth. It had measured something far simpler and far more unsettling. It had measured the shape of the dangers each species had needed to survive in order to reach the stars at all. I did not know, at that point, what kind of world produces a mind that solves a 3-century puzzle in under a minute without appearing to notice the accomplishment. I only knew that whatever kind of world it was, it must have been very different from mine, and very different, I suspected, from every world represented in that classroom. It was around this time that I finally spoke with Daniel Voss directly, for the first real conversation between us, though we had shared a classroom for weeks by then. It happened almost by accident, in the quiet study hall late one evening, when I found myself alone at a table with my own box still stubbornly sealed in front of me, turning it over out of habit more than hope, and he happened to sit at the same table to finish reading through a set of tactical case studies for another course. He noticed the box in my hands and asked, politely, how my own progress was going. I told him, honestly, that I had made none. I told him this without the shame I might have expected to feel, because something about his manner made shame feel unnecessary, almost beside the point. He nodded, unsurprised, and asked if I minded him looking at it, the same request Priya Halden had made of him weeks earlier. I handed it over. He turned it in his hands slowly this time, more slowly than he had turned his own box that first morning, and I understood, watching him, that this slowness was deliberate, a kind of courtesy extended to me, rather than a limit on his own ability. He studied the surface for perhaps 30 seconds, longer than he had spent on Priya's box, and then he handed it back to me without opening it, exactly as he had done for her. He told me that mine was built differently than his had been, the mechanism reversed in a way that made the usual pressure points misleading, rather than helpful, a deliberate trap built into the design. He said this with a kind of quiet respect, almost admiration, for whoever had built it centuries ago, as though he genuinely appreciated the craftsmanship even while recognizing its flaw. I asked him then, the question I had been circling for weeks, without finding the courage to ask it directly. I asked him why it had been so easy for him, when it had been so difficult for everyone else in that room. He considered the question for a long moment, longer than he usually paused before answering anything, and when he finally spoke, his answer surprised me, because it was not an answer about puzzles at all. He told me that where he came from, the world he had grown up on, quick decisions had often been the only decisions available. He said his people had spent much of their history in environments that did not give them the luxury of long deliberation, environments where hesitation carried real and immediate costs, and where the mind that acted quickly, even imperfectly, often survived situations that punished the mind that waited to be certain. He was careful, as he said this, not to describe it as something painful or dramatic. He spoke of it the way you might describe a simple fact of geography, a mountain range that shaped which roads a civilization eventually built, without dwelling on the difficulty of crossing that range in the first place. But I heard, underneath his careful, understated words, something that I recognized instantly, because it echoed the same undertone I had heard in my own mother's voice, whenever she spoke about the long, hard history that had shaped Savani patience in the first place. Every species carries its history and its habits. My people had been shaped by open plains where danger arrived slowly, visible from a great distance, rewarding those who waited and watched before acting. Humans, it seemed, had been shaped by something else entirely. Something that did not offer the luxury of visible, slow-approaching danger. Something that had instead rewarded speed and instinct in situations where hesitation itself became the greater risk. I did not fully understand, that evening, what kind of history could produce such a habit of mind. I only understood that it was real, and that it explained, more clearly than any puzzle box ever could, why Daniel Voss had walked into that first classroom and solved in a single motion something the rest of us had been trained across our entire lives to treat as a slow, patient labor. I thanked him for his honesty. He seemed slightly uncomfortable with my gratitude, the same discomfort he showed whenever attention settled on him for too long, and he changed the subject quickly, asking instead about my own studies, my own homeworld, questions he asked with what I now recognize as genuine curiosity rather than polite deflection. We spoke for nearly an hour that evening, about small things, ordinary things, the kind of conversation any two cadets might share in a quiet study hall late at night. And yet I left that conversation carrying something heavier than I had carried into it, a growing certainty that the box had only been the first small sign of something much larger, something the Academy itself was only beginning to understand, and something that would not stay contained within a single classroom for very much longer. The third week of term brought the first real test that had nothing to do with boxes at all, and it was this test, more than anything that came before it, that convinced the wider Academy that something unusual had arrived among us. Every cadet in our year was required to take part in a joint exercise known as the strategy trial, a tradition almost as old as the box itself, though far more practical in its purpose. Cadets were placed into small teams and given a simulated crisis, a scenario built by the instructors to test judgment under pressure, and each team had a limited window to propose a response before the simulation moved forward on its own, whether the team had answered or not. The scenario that term involved a fictional trade dispute between two allied stations, escalating quickly into a situation with real strategic consequences, the kind of layered, uncertain problem that had no single correct answer, only a range of responses that could be judged better or worse, depending on how carefully a team had considered the consequences of each choice. I was placed on a team with Mira Thal, Bren Solvig, and, to the visible surprise of nearly everyone present, Daniel Voss. I want to be honest about my own feelings entering that exercise, because I think the honesty matters to understanding what followed. I was nervous, not simply about the exercise itself, which I had prepared for diligently, but about working directly beside Daniel for the first time, in a setting that demanded quick, high-stakes decisions, rather than quiet, patient study. Everything I had learned about him so far suggested he would move quickly, and everything I had been trained to value suggested that quick decisions, in situations with real consequences, were dangerous decisions. The simulation began, and the crisis unfolded exactly as designed, growing more complicated with each passing minute. Additional information arriving from simulated sources, some of it useful, much of it deliberately distracting, designed to test whether cadets could separate signal from noise under time pressure. Mira moved first, as she often did, proposing a cautious opening position, one designed to buy time while gathering more information before committing to any firm strategy. It was a reasonable proposal, the kind any well-trained cadet might offer, and I found myself nodding along with it, ready to refine the details. Bren, true to his Doran nature, argued for patience beyond even Mira's proposal, suggesting we wait through an additional information cycle before responding at all, gathering as much certainty as the simulation would allow before committing our team to any position. I watched Daniel during this exchange, and I noticed something that unsettled me more than any sudden action could have. He was not impatient. He listened carefully to both Mira and Bren, nodding at points that seemed genuinely useful to him, asking a single clarifying question about a detail in the simulated trade data that neither of us had considered. He gave every appearance of a cadet content to let the discussion continue at its natural pace. Then, with what felt like no transition at all, he said that he believed we were running out of time to act, and that further waiting would cost us more than it gained. He said this calmly, without urgency in his voice, which somehow made it more unsettling rather than less. He then outlined, in perhaps 90 seconds, a response that incorporated Mira's caution and Bren's desire for information, but compressed into a form that could be executed immediately, rather than after another full cycle of waiting. He identified, with unnerving speed, exactly which pieces of the simulated crisis were true threats, and which were distractions built into the exercise specifically to waste a team's limited time. Mira hesitated. Bren looked, for a long moment, as though he might object on principle alone, patience being as close to sacred among Doran cadets as it was among my own people. But something in Daniel's calm, unhurried delivery made the proposal difficult to dismiss outright, and after a brief, tense discussion, our team adopted a version of his plan, modified slightly by Mira's caution, and submitted it with nearly half the available time still remaining on the simulation clock. I will not pretend our team's response was flawless. It was not. The simulation, evaluated afterward by the instructors overseeing the exercise, judged our response as strong but imperfect, missing one secondary consequence that a slower, more exhaustive analysis might have caught. But here is the detail that mattered most. The detail that spread through the academy faster than any story about a box ever could. Every other team in our year used the full window of time allotted to them, every single one, and several teams still submitted responses judged weaker than ours, responses built more slowly, but not more wisely. Our team, moving at a pace that felt reckless to at least 2 of its 4 members, produced a result that stood among the strongest in the entire year, achieved in less than half the time anyone else had used. The instructors overseeing the exercise noticed immediately. I watched them during the debrief, watched the way their eyes moved toward Daniel Voss with an attention that mirrored, almost exactly, the attention Elder Thresh had shown him weeks earlier over the opened box. One instructor, a sharp-eyed Corvain named Aldrich Venn, asked Daniel directly how he had identified the true threats so quickly, amid the deliberately confusing simulated data. Daniel's answer, once again, was simple, in a way that felt almost dismissive of its own significance. He said that most crises, real or simulated, contained far less genuine complexity than they appeared to contain on the surface. He said that a great deal of the noise in any crisis was designed, whether by an enemy or by an instructor building an exercise, to consume the attention of anyone trying to solve it, and that the real skill lay not in processing every piece of information available, but in quickly discarding the pieces that did not matter, so that full attention could be given to the pieces that did. He said this, again, without any apparent awareness that he was describing a skill that most cadets in that room, myself included, had spent years trying and largely failing to develop. Aldrich Venn did not respond immediately. He simply looked at Daniel for a long moment, the same searching look I had seen from Elder Thresh, and then he moved on to the next team's debrief without further comment, though I noticed him make a note on his datapad, brief and private, the kind of note an instructor makes when something has occurred to them that they intend to discuss later with colleagues rather than students. Word of the exercise spread through the academy within a day, faster even than the story of the box, because this time, the demonstration had not happened in a quiet classroom with only 22 witnesses. It had happened in an exercise judged by multiple instructors, evaluated against every other team in the year, producing a measurable, comparable result that could not be dismissed as luck or exaggeration. I noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle shift in how cadets spoke about Daniel Voss. The earlier tone, curious and faintly nervous, hardened into something closer to genuine unease, though it rarely showed itself directly. Cadets were polite to him, even friendly in most cases, because he had done nothing unkind, nothing that invited open hostility. But conversations about him, when he was not present, had taken on a different character than they carried in that first week. Mira Thal put it most directly, one evening, as we walked back from a shared meal, Daniel having already left ahead of us to continue his own studies. She said that she had begun to feel, watching him work through the strategy trial, less like she was watching a gifted classmate, and more like she was watching a demonstration of something the rest of us simply were not built to do, no matter how hard we studied or how long we practiced. She said this without malice toward Daniel himself, whom she genuinely liked by that point, but with a kind of quiet grief for a gap she had not previously known existed between her own capabilities and someone else's. I understood the feeling, because I carried a version of it myself. It was not envy exactly, though envy was present somewhere in the mixture. It was closer to the feeling of learning, that a mountain you had spent your whole life training to climb had, for someone else, never really been a mountain at all, simply a hill they walked over without noticing the elevation. Elder Kion Thresh called a meeting of senior instructors that week, a meeting I only learned about because Mira, once again drawing on her considerable talent for overhearing things she was not meant to overhear, caught fragments of a conversation between two junior instructors, discussing it in the corridor outside our study hall. The details she gathered were incomplete, but the shape of them was clear enough. The instructors had begun discussing, formally now rather than in private speculation, what Daniel Voss's demonstrated abilities might mean for how the Academy trained and evaluated future human cadets, given that more were expected to arrive in the terms ahead. There was talk, Mira said, of adjusting certain exercises entirely, of reconsidering whether the traditional pace of instruction, built across centuries around the assumption of careful, gradual mastery, still served its purpose for a species that appeared to absorb and apply complex judgment at a speed the rest of the galaxy had never needed to plan for. I do not know how much of what Mira overheard was accurate, and how much was colored by her own excitement at having gathered such an interesting fragment of gossip, but I know that within 2 weeks of that meeting, several of our exercises did change, subtly at first. Timing windows shortened slightly, information density and simulations increased, as though the instructors were quietly recalibrating their entire understanding of what a demanding challenge looked like, using Daniel Voss, whether he knew it or not, as their new measuring stick. He did not seem to notice this either, at least not outwardly. He continued attending classes with the same steady, unhurried presence he had carried since that very first day, still quiet, still polite, still visibly uncomfortable whenever attention lingered on him too long. If he understood that he was reshaping the Academy's entire approach to training simply by existing within it, he gave no sign of understanding, and I had begun to believe, by that point, that this was not modesty on his part, but genuine, uncomplicated honesty. He truly did not see himself as remarkable. He saw himself, as far as I could tell, as an ordinary cadet doing his best with the tools his upbringing had given him. It was that honesty, more than any single demonstrated skill, that unsettled me the most, as that third week drew to a close. A being who knows he is exceptional, and hides it is, at least, a being whose behavior you can predict, once you understand the shape of the mask he wears. A being who is exceptional, and genuinely does not know it, is far harder to predict, because he offers you no warning before the next demonstration, no signal that something remarkable is about to happen, no pause before he turns a locked box in his hands, or compresses 90 minutes of careful deliberation into 90 seconds of calm, quiet judgment. I remember thinking, walking back to my quarters that night, that if this was what one ordinary human cadet looked like among us, unremarkable by his own people's standards, then I did not yet have the imagination to guess what an extraordinary one might be capable of, and I was not at all certain I wanted to find out. By the middle of the term, the questions surrounding Daniel Voss had stopped belonging only to our year, and had started climbing upward through the Academy, in a way that felt, to those of us who had watched it begin, both strange and slightly frightening, the way it feels to watch a small fire you lit for warmth begin spreading further than you intended. I learned how far it had spread through an unlikely source, a cousin of mine named Talus, older than me by several years, who had already graduated from the Academy, and now served as a junior officer aboard a supply vessel, stationed not far from our system. Talus contacted me one evening through the Academy's personal message system, something she rarely did, since our correspondence had always been infrequent, limited mostly to formal greetings during shared family occasions. She asked me, without much preamble, whether the stories were true. I asked her which stories she meant, though I suspected I already knew. She told me that word had reached her ship, and several others in her small fleet, about a human cadet at our academy who had solved the instructor's box before taking his seat, and who had, in a separate incident, led a strategy exercise to a top result in half the allotted time. She said the story had been retold so many times across so many ships and stations that she could no longer tell which details were accurate and which had been exaggerated in the telling, and she wanted to hear the truth from someone she trusted, rather than continue guessing. I told her everything I have already told you, as plainly as I could, without embellishment, because I did not want to add my own voice to a story that already seemed to be growing beyond anyone's ability to control it. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then she told me something that stayed with me for the rest of that term. She said that officers on her ship, and on at least 2 others she knew of, had begun quietly running their own small tests on the handful of human personnel who had already entered various branches of the joint fleet, testing them the way our academy had tested Daniel, using old puzzles, old riddles, old exercises that had traditionally taken new officers weeks or months to master. She said the results were inconsistent in an unsettling way. Some humans solved these tests with the same startling speed Daniel had shown with the box. Others struggled with them, exactly as any other species might, taking the expected amount of time, showing no unusual aptitude at all. There was no clear pattern, she said, no way to predict in advance which humans would show the strange, rapid capability, and which would not. And that inconsistency, more than anything else, was what worried the officers she spoke with. I asked her why inconsistency would worry them more than a consistent, predictable ability would. She explained it to me carefully, the way an older relative explains something to a younger one they still consider partly a child. She said that a predictable ability, even an extraordinary one, could eventually be planned around, accounted for, built into strategy, the way any known quantity is built into strategy. But an ability that showed up unpredictably, present in one human and absent in another, with no visible marker to distinguish which was which in advance, was a kind of uncertainty that made careful planning far more difficult. You could not know, meeting a human officer for the first time, whether you were meeting someone who would take the expected amount of time to solve a problem, or someone who would solve it before you had finished explaining it to them. I thought about this conversation for days afterward, turning it over the way I turn over any problem I do not yet understand, and I began to notice, once I knew what to look for, small signs that the unease Talus described was not limited to her own small fleet. Instructors at our academy grew visibly more careful in how they discussed humans during lessons, choosing their words with a precision that had not been there earlier in the term. A guest lecturer, brought in during the 6th week to discuss interspecies diplomatic protocol, spent an unusually long portion of her lesson addressing what she called the challenge of unpredictable capability, though she never mentioned Daniel Voss by name, and never explicitly stated that she was discussing humans at all. Everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant regardless. Daniel himself remained, through all of this, remarkably unaware of the scale of the reaction his presence had caused. I continued to speak with him occasionally, in the quiet study hall or during shared meals, and he never once brought up the growing attention surrounding him, never seemed to notice the careful, watchful way certain instructors observed him during lessons. When I finally worked up the nerve, during one of our evening conversations, to tell him some of what my cousin had described, the quiet testing happening aboard various fleet vessels, he looked genuinely surprised and, for the first time since I had known him, faintly troubled. He told me he had not realized any of that was happening. He said he had assumed, when cadets asked him about the box, that their curiosity was simple and passing, the kind of interest any unusual event generates briefly, before attention moves elsewhere. He had not imagined that a single small puzzle, solved on his first morning at the academy, could ripple outward into quiet testing programs aboard fleet vessels he had never even heard of. I asked him, carefully, whether he thought the concern was justified. I asked him directly whether he believed humans truly possessed some unusual capability that the rest of the galaxy had not yet learned to understand or predict. He considered the question for a long time before answering, longer than he usually paused, and when he finally spoke, his answer surprised me in a way I had not expected, because it was, for the first time in any conversation we had shared, genuinely uncertain. He said he did not know. He said that from his own perspective, growing up among other humans, nothing about his own abilities had ever felt unusual at all. He had grown up around people who solved problems quickly, who acted decisively under pressure, who treated hesitation as a cost to be avoided, rather than a virtue to be cultivated, and he had simply absorbed those habits the way any child absorbs the habits of the people around them, without ever considering that other species might have built their entire cultures around a different set of assumptions entirely. He said that hearing about the inconsistency my cousin described, some humans showing this rapid capability and others not, troubled him more than anything else, because it suggested that whatever quality the galaxy had begun to notice in his species was not a fixed trait shared equally by all humans, but something shaped by circumstance, by upbringing, by the particular pressures and dangers each individual human had happened to grow up around. And if that was true, he said, then predicting which humans would show this capability, and under what circumstances it might appear even in humans who had not shown it before, was a genuinely difficult problem, one he did not think anyone, human or otherwise, currently had a good answer for. I remember sitting with him in that quiet study hall, both of us turning over the same unsettling thought from our very different perspectives, and feeling, for the first time, a kind of unexpected kinship with him. He was as uncertain about the shape of what his own species represented as the rest of the galaxy was uncertain about it. He had not arrived at the academy with some secret understanding of his own exceptional nature, hidden behind a careful mask of modesty. He had arrived, as far as I could now tell, genuinely unaware that he carried anything unusual at all, and the growing attention surrounding him was, if anything, teaching him something new about his own people, at the same pace it was teaching the rest of us. This did not comfort me as much as I had expected it to. If anything, it deepened the unease I had been carrying since that very first morning. A predictable danger, however severe, can eventually be planned around, as Talus had said. But a danger that did not fully understand its own shape, that could not reliably predict its own capabilities in advance, seemed to me a far harder thing to prepare for, precisely because even its source could not tell you, with any confidence, what it might do next. The remainder of that 6th week passed quietly on the surface, classes continuing as scheduled, exercises proceeding without further dramatic incident. But beneath that quiet surface, I could feel the shape of the term shifting, the way you feel weather changing, before the sky itself gives any visible sign. Instructors held more private meetings than usual. Messages traveled between our academy and other stations at a pace that suggested more than routine administrative business. And somewhere in the wider fleet, officers I would never meet continued their own quiet tests on human personnel, gathering data, building a picture none of them yet fully understood, trying to answer a question that Daniel Voss himself had just admitted, with quiet honesty, that even he could not answer. What made a human capable of opening without hesitation doors that generations of careful, patient cadets before them had needed months or years to open? And what did it mean, for the rest of us, that no one, not even the humans themselves, could yet say for certain which doors those would turn out to be? The turning point, the moment when what had been a quiet academic curiosity became something the wider fleet could no longer treat as a passing story, arrived in the 9th week of term, when a senior officer named Colonel Grace Bennett visited the academy in person. I did not know, when I first saw her walking through our corridor beside Elder Kion Thresh, that her visit had anything to do with Daniel Voss. Senior officers visited the academy periodically throughout every term, inspecting facilities, observing exercises, occasionally lecturing on their own areas of expertise. Her presence, on its own, raised no particular alarm among the cadets who noticed her passing. It was only later, again through Mira Thal's considerable talent for being present near important conversations without quite being noticed, that I learned Colonel Bennett was human, and that her visit had been arranged specifically because of the reports that had traveled up through the fleet regarding Daniel Voss and the small but growing number of similar incidents involving human personnel elsewhere. Colonel Bennett was, by every account I gathered afterward, precisely and deliberately unremarkable in her manner, much like Daniel himself. She wore her uniform without ornament beyond what regulation required. She spoke, in the one lecture she gave to our year during her visit, with a calm, measured pace that gave no hint of urgency, even as the content of what she said carried real weight. She spoke that day about the early history of her own species, a history I had studied only in the broadest strokes during our general education courses, the kind of brief overview given to all cadets before more detailed study in later terms. She spoke of a homeworld shaped by long competition between many different groups of her own kind, a history marked by repeated, difficult conflict long before humans had ever developed the means to leave their own world at all. She spoke of it plainly, without either shame or pride, the way a geologist might describe the forces that shaped a mountain range, forces neither good nor bad in themselves, simply present, simply real. She said that her species had reached the stars later than many of the species already gathered in that room, and that this lateness had often been treated, by others in the wider galaxy, as evidence of some deficiency, some slower development that explained why humans were considered, until recently, a young and unproven people among far older civilizations. She said that this assumption had never been entirely wrong, but that it had missed something important, something her own people had only recently begun to understand about themselves as they entered wider galactic society, and began, for the first time, comparing their own history directly against the histories of species like mine, like Mira's, like Bren's. She said that where many species had developed their intelligence and their culture in relatively stable, predictable environments, rewarding patience and careful, gradual mastery, humans had developed under conditions that rewarded something different, a kind of rapid, adaptive judgment, born from constant, unpredictable competition and hardship. She said this had not made humans wiser than other species, nor more intelligent in any simple sense of the word. It had made them fast, in a specific and narrow way, that had not been widely tested against the rest of the galaxy until very recently, because humans themselves had not fully understood, until recently, that this particular quality set them apart from their neighbors. She spoke, briefly, about Daniel Voss himself, though she was careful, out of what I took to be genuine respect for him, not to single him out in a way that would embarrass him further in front of his classmates. She said that what he had done with the box, and what he had done during the strategy exercise, was not evidence of some singular genius unique to him alone. It was evidence of an ordinary human mind, shaped by an ordinary human upbringing, encountering problems that the rest of the galaxy had built, over centuries, around assumptions that simply did not hold for a species like his. Then she said something that I have carried with me ever since, something I believe captures, better than anything else I witnessed during that entire term, the true shape of what the galaxy was beginning to understand about humanity. She said that the danger humans represented, if danger was even the right word for it, was not a danger of malice or of conquest. It was a danger of mismatch, a danger born from placing a mind shaped by one set of assumptions into a galaxy built almost entirely around a different set of assumptions, and discovering, again and again, in small ways and large, that the old assumptions no longer reliably predicted what would happen next. She said the galaxy had built its diplomacy, its education, its military doctrine, its entire structure of careful, gradual trust, around species that shared, in their many different ways, a common respect for patience, as a virtue that had to be earned through slow demonstration. Humans, she said, had not been raised to demonstrate patience in that same way, because patience, on their homeworld's difficult early history, had not always been the trait most likely to keep a person alive. I remember looking around the room as she spoke, watching the faces of my fellow cadets, watching Bren Solvig's careful stillness, watching Mira's usually quick eyes fixed unusually steady on the colonel, watching even Owen Farr, who rarely took anything seriously enough to sit still, leaning forward with an attention I had never seen him give to any other lecture that term. I looked, too, at Daniel Voss, seated in his usual unremarkable place near the front, listening to a fellow human describe the shape of his own people, with the same calm, unhurried honesty he had shown every single time I had spoken with him myself. He did not look proud, hearing his own species described this way. He looked, if anything, thoughtful, perhaps a little troubled, the way anyone might look upon hearing a stranger describe, with unsettling accuracy, a truth about their own family that they had never quite put into words themselves. After the lecture ended, Elder Kion Thresh remained behind at the front of the room, and Colonel Bennett stayed a moment longer than her schedule likely allowed, the two of them speaking quietly together, while the rest of us gathered our things. I do not know what passed between them in that brief exchange, but I noticed, watching from the doorway as I gathered my own materials, that both of them glanced toward Daniel Voss at the same moment, a small, shared look that carried more weight than either of them likely intended to reveal in front of witnesses. In the days that followed Colonel Bennett's visit, I noticed changes throughout the academy that felt more significant than anything that had come before, changes that suggested the institution itself, not merely individual instructors reacting privately, had begun formally reconsidering how it approached the training of human cadets, and, in some ways, how it approached the training of every cadet who would eventually work alongside them. New material appeared in our general studies curriculum within the same week. Brief but pointed additions to our lessons on interspecies cooperation. Material that discussed, in careful academic language, the concept of adaptive judgment as a distinct cognitive style, separate from and complementary to the patient. Gradual mastery our own cultures had always emphasized. The material did not single out humans by name in every passage, but its timing, arriving so soon after Colonel Bennett's visit, left little doubt among the cadets in my year about what had prompted it. The exercises themselves changed as well, more noticeably than the subtle adjustments I had observed weeks earlier following the strategy trial. Time windows for certain simulations grew shorter across the board, not only for teams that included human cadets, but for every team, as though the instructors had decided, collectively, that the entire Academy's baseline expectations for speed under pressure needed recalibrating, whether or not a given team happened to include a human member at all. I asked Daniel, during one of our now regular evening conversations, whether he had noticed these changes himself, and whether they troubled him. He told me he had noticed, and that they did trouble him, though not in the way I might have expected. He said he worried, watching the Academy adjust itself so visibly around what his own presence had revealed, that other species might come to resent humans for forcing such rapid, uncomfortable change onto institutions that had operated the same careful way for centuries. He said he had not asked for any of this, had not intended to reshape anyone's curriculum simply by opening a box before he sat down, and he did not know how to prevent the growing attention from continuing to ripple outward in ways he could not fully predict or control. I told him, as honestly as I could, that I did not think resentment was the primary feeling spreading through the Academy, though I admitted some cadets likely felt a version of it privately. I told him that what I sensed, more than resentment, was a kind of collective unease, a recognition that the galaxy's understanding of itself, built carefully over centuries by species who had assumed they understood the basic shape of intelligence and capability across the known worlds, had suddenly encountered something that did not fit neatly into any of the categories that understanding had relied upon. He asked me, quietly, whether I was afraid of him. I considered the question honestly before answering, because I did not want to give him a comfortable lie simply to spare his feelings, and I did not think he would have wanted that from me either, given everything I had come to understand about his character by that point in the term. I told him that I was not afraid of him specifically, not of Daniel Voss, the individual cadet I had come to know across shared meals and quiet evening conversations. But I told him that I had become afraid, in a way I had not expected to feel at the start of the term, of what his species represented for a galaxy that had built its entire structure of trust and cooperation around a shared assumption of patience, an assumption his people did not universally share, and could not, by his own admission, reliably predict in advance within their own ranks. He was quiet for a long moment after I said this. Then he told me that he understood, and that he shared some version of the same unease himself, though from the opposite direction, wondering constantly what his own quick instincts might cost him, or cost the people around him, in situations where patience, rather than speed, would have been the wiser choice. We did not resolve that conversation with any easy comfort for either of us. I do not think such a conversation could have ended that way, given everything both of us had come to understand by that point. But I left it feeling, for the first time, that whatever the galaxy was beginning to learn about humanity, it was not learning it from a species that fully understood its own nature either, and that this shared uncertainty, strange as it felt, might eventually matter more than any single demonstrated ability, however unsettling that ability had first appeared. The term ended, as all terms eventually do, with a quiet ceremony rather than a dramatic conclusion, and I have come to believe, looking back on it now from a distance of several years, that this quiet ending was itself the most important part of the entire story, though it took me a long time to understand why. The final ceremony gathered our whole year together in the same hall where the term had begun, the same hall where Elder Kion Thresh had first distributed the boxes, the same hall where Daniel Voss had walked through the door and, before taking his seat, changed the shape of everything that followed. Cadets who had opened their boxes during the term stood to have their names formally added to the wall in the lower archive, a small procession of quiet pride, Families and instructors gathered to witness names being carved beside the names of cadets who had come before them across 3 centuries of patient tradition. Daniel Voss's name was not among the names read aloud that day. I want to be careful in explaining this, because it would be easy to misunderstand it as some final twist, some correction of the record that undid everything that had come before. That is not what happened. Daniel's name had been added to the wall weeks earlier, quietly, without ceremony, at his own request, a fact I only learned that final day when Elder Thresh mentioned it briefly during his closing remarks. Daniel had asked, apparently soon after the incident itself, whether his name could be added without the public reading that other cadets received, explaining to the instructor, as he later explained to me, that he did not feel he had earned the ceremony in the way the tradition intended it, since he had not experienced the long, patient struggle the ceremony was designed to honor. Elder Thresh had granted this request, and had, in fact, told very few people about it at all, which was why even Mira Thale, usually so reliably informed about every detail concerning Daniel, had not known his name already rested quietly on that wall throughout the very term we spent discussing him. I found this detail more moving than almost anything else that happened across the entire term, because it revealed something about Daniel's character that all the earlier demonstrations of speed and capability had somehow failed to make fully visible. He was not merely unaware of his own exceptional nature, the way I had come to believe by the middle of the term. He was actively, deliberately humble about it, in a way that required real thought and real care, not simply an accident of temperament. Elder Kion Thresh addressed our entire year during his closing remarks that day, and though he had said little publicly about Daniel Voss across the whole preceding term, he chose, in this final address, to speak about him directly, and about what the term had taught the Academy as a whole. He said that he had given out that same box, in one form or another, for more years than most cadets in the room had been alive, and that across all those years, he had come to believe he understood exactly what the box measured, and exactly what it could teach him about any new species that arrived at the Academy's doors. He said that Daniel Voss had taught him, in a single unhurried motion on the very first morning of this term, that he had been wrong, not about the value of patience itself, which he still believed in deeply, but about the assumption that patience was the only path capable of producing wisdom, or courage, or the kind of judgment the Academy hoped to cultivate in every cadet who passed through its halls. He said that the wider fleet, the wider galaxy itself, now faced the same lesson he had faced that first morning, watching a box open, before a chair had even been sat in. A new people had arrived among the stars, shaped by a history different from any other history the galaxy had previously encountered, and that difference could not be safely ignored, dismissed, or simply folded into old assumptions without real, careful reconsideration. He did not call this difference a danger, not in his closing remarks, though I remembered his earlier words from weeks before, about armor, and about minds that did not require the same armor to survive contact with difficulty. I understood, hearing him speak that final day, that he had spent the whole term turning that earlier warning over in his own mind, much as I had turned it over in mine, and had arrived, by the end of it, at something more complicated than simple fear. He said that the true lesson of the term was not that humans were dangerous, and not that the rest of the galaxy's careful, patient traditions were somehow wrong or outdated. He said the true lesson was that the galaxy could no longer assume it fully understood the shape of every mind it would encounter among the stars, and that this uncertainty, uncomfortable as it was, represented an opportunity as much as a risk, if approached with the same careful attention the Academy had always tried to teach its cadets to bring to every difficult problem they encountered. I do not know how much of the wider fleet's response to humanity, in the months and years that followed, could be traced directly back to that single quiet morning when Daniel Voss opened a box before he sat down. I suspect the truth is more complicated than any single moment can fully explain, that humanity's growing presence among the stars was reshaping galactic assumptions through countless small incidents across many different stations and academies, of which our own classroom was only one small part. But I know what I witnessed personally, across that single strange and unforgettable term, and I know what it taught me about the limits of my own assumptions I had carried since childhood, believing them as fixed and certain as the ground beneath my feet. I graduated from the academy 2 years after that term ended, and I have served since then aboard a joint vessel that includes several human officers among its crew. Officers I have come to know, and, in most cases, to respect deeply, though I confess I still find myself occasionally startled by the speed of a decision, the suddenness of an instinct, the quiet confidence with which a human colleague will act on a judgment formed in seconds, rather than the careful hours my own training still quietly urges me to take. I still think, from time to time, about Daniel Voss, though we lost touch after graduation, as cadets often do, scattered across different postings throughout the wider fleet. I heard, some years later, that he had gone on to serve in a diplomatic capacity, rather than a purely military one, a choice that did not surprise me at all, given the quiet, careful way he had always handled the attention his own abilities attracted, even when that attention made him visibly uncomfortable. I think, too, about Elder Kion Thresh, and about the box itself, which I understand is still given to every new cadet who arrives at the academy, though I have heard, from younger cousins who have since studied there themselves, that the tradition has changed in small but meaningful ways. Instructors now speak more openly, from the very first day, about the box measuring not a single fixed standard of patience, but a range of different cognitive approaches, each valuable in its own context, each carrying its own particular risks. I do not know if this change has made the tradition wiser or simply more complicated. I suspect it has made it more honest, which may amount to the same thing in the end. What I know for certain, sitting now with the full weight of everything that followed that single strange morning, is this. The nightmare that some cadets whispered about in those early weeks, the fear that humanity represented some unpredictable danger the galaxy was not prepared to face, was never really about malice, or conquest, or any deliberate threat humans posed to the rest of us. It was, and remains, a nightmare of uncertainty, the discomfort of discovering that the universe contains minds, shaped by histories so different from our own, that our oldest, most carefully built assumptions can no longer reliably predict what such a mind might do next, or how quickly it might do it. That uncertainty has not gone away in the years since that term ended. If anything, it has grown, as more humans have entered wider galactic society, each one carrying their own particular mixture of speed and patience, capability and limitation, in patterns that still resist easy prediction. But I no longer think of that uncertainty only as a nightmare, the way I did during those first anxious weeks, watching a box open before a chair had even been sat in. I think of it now as the beginning of something the galaxy had needed for a very long time, whether it understood that need or not. A reminder that patience, however deeply we value it, however carefully our own histories have taught us to practice it, was never the only path capable of producing courage, or wisdom, or the quiet, steady judgment that allows a person to do what is needed, even before they have fully understood why. Daniel Voss never meant to teach us that lesson. I am certain of this, having known him, however briefly, well enough to trust his own quiet, genuine confusion at the attention his actions caused. He simply opened a box, the way he had opened countless small puzzles throughout his own ordinary childhood, without pausing to consider that the rest of us had built our entire understanding of patience, and of ourselves, around the assumption that such things could never be opened quickly at all. He was wrong to assume it would go unnoticed, and the galaxy, in turn, was wrong to assume it already understood everything worth knowing about the shape of a mind before that mind had even walked through the door.